I left Kashmir Valley in 1990. I was 14 years old. But I've been going to Kashmir as a journalist since 1998, and I make it a point to visit Kashmir every year, almost 3-4 times a year. I'll begin with a small story, and then we'll go ahead with our own story. In the April of 2001, I was a young TV reporter, and I was sent by my office to cover an assignment in Kashmir Valley. So I left one fine afternoon, and this is 2001. Since the situation was not very good in those days, there was a lot of trouble. And I reached Delhi airport, and I met this old friend of mine who was a photographer with the Hindustan Times in Delhi. His name was Pradeep Bhatia, and we would meet very often on assignments in Delhi. And I saw him at the airport, and I spoke to him. I said, "Oh, where are you going?" He said, "I'm going to Kashmir. How about you?" I said, "I'm going to Kashmir too." And then we realized that we had to check in the same hotel. So fair enough, two is always better than one, and we boarded this aircraft together, and we landed in Kashmir Valley. We took a cab and reached our hotel, and then went to a friend who worked with the Indian Army, and we got we spoke to him for some time, and we had some tea, etc. Then we returned early in the evening to be back in the hotel before the unofficial curfew begins. And we spent I think we were awake till midnight, and my friend got a little sentimental. He was reciting Kishore Kumar's songs, etc. And we must have slept by midnight. The next morning when we woke, it was a sunny day, and we were having breakfast in the lobby when we heard this loud bang. Now we're in Kashmir, and you know what a loud bang in Kashmir means. It means there's been some kind of explosion or some kind of operation somewhere nearby, and we leave our breakfast and we rush outside, and sure, very close to our hotel, there's a bomb blast, and a couple of cops have died. And I'm there, and Pradeep, my friend from the Hindustan Times, he's furiously clicking pictures, and there's a white ambassador car parked in the lane, and I have nothing to do because I'm waiting for officials to come. The officials have not come. My cameraman is not there, and I've just kept my elbow on the car, and I'm waiting for people to come. And suddenly I heard this someone calling my name from behind, and I look behind. There's this BSF official I used to know from my previous assignments. So we meet, we sort of hug each other, and he asked me, "When did you come?" I said, I came yesterday, and I'm here on an assignment. So he just kept his hand on my shoulder and sort of took me away from the scene, and took me in a by lane. Must have been a matter of maybe 2 or 3 minutes. So he began telling me, he said, you should never rush through such places because, and he did not complete his sentence, because I thought that before my mind could register, my legs had started to shake. And I just did this to my lips, and there was explosive powder there. So in hindsight, when I look at it, it felt as if I had passed through a ball of fire. And I just turned behind, and the BSF officer, my friend, was trying to tell me that you should not rush to such places because there are times when the militants have kept another bomb to target security personnel who rush to such spots. And I just turned behind, and there's a JK police commander whose whole body is in tatters, his whole body is shivering. He's holding a AK-47 in his hand. And he walks from here till the speaker, and he falls down and collapses and, of course, dies. There's a very young boy of about 12 years age who's standing outside a handicraft showroom, and he's so shocked that he's crying, "Sahab, maine kuch nahi kiya, sahab, maine kuch nahi kiya." So later we realized that the bomb, the second bomb which exploded, was kept in that white ambassador car on which I had kept my elbow, and my friend Pradeep Bhatia, his body was blown into pieces. He died instantly. He could not be saved. So when I came back to Delhi, I realized there was this term which was not popular in those days. We heard of it later. I believe in America it is very popular. It's called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So we had no idea. So I thought I suffered from PTSD for some time after that episode. But in our case, I think we've had the Kashmiri Pandit community had its own PTSDs many times over. My mother comes from this place in North Kashmir, Baramulla, and she was a toddler when the tribesman attack happened, when the marauding tribesmen came from the northwest frontier province and attacked village after village. And villages were razed to ground, and in that process, my grandfather's, the house that my maternal grandfather had built was reduced to ashes. So in 1947, for the first time, and perhaps it has happened before also, of which we have no record, so they became refugees in their own state for the first time, and they had to come to Srinagar and live for a few days in a refugee camp, and then in a rented accommodation in the old part of Srinagar. And that's where my mother met my father, and in the late 60s they got married, and I was born in this house they had built together in this Srinagar suburb called Chandpura. Now the house was again, like many of us, we came from a middle class family. It was built by my father's provident fund, he says, and my mother's bridal jewelry. So that house was again lost to us in the winter of 1990. After we left Kashmir, my family left on the morning of 4th April 1990. My parents have never been able to go back. And I think we faced the most extreme time of our lives immediately after our exodus from Kashmir in the hot, dusty plains of Jammu city. There was absolute chaos, I remember, and I mentioned this old man in my book who was found dead in this refugee camp with a pack of chilled milk pressed against his right cheek. He used to live in this muthi camp, and he thought that at least that chilled pack of milk would provide him some succor from the heat, which unfortunately did not happen. Those years, so many people died of sunstroke, snake and scorpion bites, exhaustion, stress-induced heart disease. I believe the readership of the Daily Excelsior increased manyfold. It's still run because the Kashmiri Pandits buy it every day to see the obituaries. Who among us has died. And in those days, in 90, 91, 92, 93, many of us did die in an alien land when the Indian state had collapsed completely, and there was nobody was bothered about us. So that trend has continued for all these years. And there's no respite from this trend. In 1947, we became refugees in our own state. In 1990, we became refugees in our own country. So I basically started thinking about this book when I was in college, which was in 93, 96. But at that point of time, I was very young, and I had not read many books, and my language was very raw and crude. But I wanted to write this book. and I think it's partially because of this book that I chose to become a journalist and then a writer. So from 2000 onwards, I think I actually started seriously writing it. Whatever little I could remember, and those images started coming back to me in bits and pieces, and I started writing these passages. But I found it an extremely difficult book to write because of the personal history involved. Particularly the passages, the portions dealing with my own brother's murder, who was dragged out of a bus along with his two other Pandit colleagues. He was a professor of botany and shot dead by the terrorists of Hizbul Mujahideen. So all this happened, and I gave up because I just could not wade through those dark portions, dark passages. So in mid-2000s, my work, because I'm a journalist, my work took me to other areas, the Maoist areas, and I ended up writing a couple of books, and I'm thankful that I wrote those books because those books took my mind away from my own story. And when I returned to this story in 2009, 4 years ago, I thought by that time I was very obstinate, and I thought I will have to wade through these patches of darkness, and I'll have to write this story. And I wrote this story because in the last few years, I became increasingly angry about the way our story was relegated to the margins. So there was this one whole narrative which came from our friends in Kashmir Valley about the state excesses and the fact that there were Indian brutalities in that part of Kashmir. But what the media chose to ignore, or the international policy groups chose to ignore, is the fact that here's a set of people who have been brutalized by the Indian state, but they are the same people who have brutalized another set of people who happen to be the Kashmiri Pandits in this case. Now, while I was writing this book, I found it very difficult to get testimonies from people, especially in Jammu, because I thought they'd moved on and they would not want to talk about this. So I would go from house to house, talk to my relatives, talk to my friends, talk to my journalist friends, and ask them if they knew of someone who had a story to tell as far as 1990 is concerned, or 1986 Anantnag riots are concerned. There have been so many events in all these years which have gone unrecorded, and they're almost buried. I almost slipped into depression. I was looking for some testimonies from the 1947 tribesman attack, and one day I landed up at this house in Bodi in Jammu, and there was a man who had survived that tribesman attack, and I just realized that he had died at the age of 92, just 2 weeks before I landed up at his doorstep. So that was very frustrating. And there were some stories which made me very curious, and I wanted to explore them further. One of the prominent stories I wanted to explore is the story of Vandhama, this sleepy hamlet in central Kashmir, where a massacre of Kashmiri Pandits took place on the evening of 25th January 1998, where this whole cluster of Kashmiri Pandit households was wiped out one evening. And there was only one lone survivor of that massacre, in which 23 Kashmiri Pandits, 11 women, 2 children lost their lives. While I was researching this massacre, and I was going through some reports which have been filed by local Kashmiri reporters in Kashmir, they gave me a sense of, disbelief, really. The way they were filed, in the sense that, you had there these pictures of these dead bodies lying on dried straw, and local women wailing over the bodies, etc. And they carved this, stereotype story where everything is all right, and some people have come from across the border and done this killing, and these people are really angry about that, and they are wailing because they are brothers and sisters, etc. So I started looking for this guy, because this person had not spoken to many people, and not many people knew where he had gone after that massacre. So I came to know that he'd been taken care of by the government. He was offered a job after his education was complete, and he was an employee with the state government. He used to work with the secretariat, state secretariat. I put up a couple of people on the job, and finally after a few days I got his number, and I spoke to him. And I was not sure whether I should speak to him in Kashmiri or whether I should speak to him in Hindi, whether that would be a handicap. But I finally spoke to him and I told him that I wanted to meet him. But he was very elusive, and rightfully so. I mean, we can understand why he was so elusive. He did not want to go through those memories again. So I've never been so persistent in my whole career as I've been persistent with this particular story. God knows what happened to me in those days. I used to stay in this small hotel in Jammu, because when I go to Jammu for work, I don't stay with my relatives, who all of them are in Jammu, because then it only becomes an issue of eating food, you know. So one, as a journalist, you don't want to go through that exercise. So I was staying in this hotel, and every single day, for days altogether, I think for almost a week, I called this person. I tried to get in touch with him. Sometimes he would pick up my call, and then he would just go silent on the phone, not speak to me at all, and there would be these embarrassing silences in between. And I would have no idea how to sort of gauge those, how to lay a bridge across that chasm between us. Then he would say, I do not want to repeat that story. Then I would try to tell him, for God's sake, I even quoted Milan Kundera to him, which he had no idea about. So I sort of persisted for many days. Sometimes he would say, call me after half an hour. I would call after half an hour. The phone would be switched off. Then I would speak to, try again after 2 hours. Then his cousin or a friend would pick up the phone. He would say, no, he's not well, call tomorrow. Then I would call tomorrow. But finally, my hard work paid off, and he finally, and I think with some divine intervention, that he finally agreed to meet me, and we met. And when we met, he spoke for non-stop 3-4 hours. And the story he told me was diametrically opposite from all those narratives I had read on the internet about the events of that particular evening in Vandhama on 25th January 1998. He told me very clearly that that particular evening the terrorists had come and shot his entire family and extended family and relatives and his neighbors, leading to the death of these 23 hapless Kashmiri Pandits. And he was hiding behind a heap of cow dung cakes. And he says that, and I think this is one image and this is one memory which I'll never forget. A 14-year-old boy, imagine, ladies and gentlemen, who is hiding on that harsh winter night behind a heap of cow dung cakes, and his whole family, extended family, father, mother, brothers, sisters, they're all dead in the courtyard. And in his, in his childishness, he thought if he, saves them from the cold, maybe they will be safe. So in the midnight, on this particular night, he drags quilts out of his house. So he drags these quilts out of his house and puts it on all these bodies, hoping that they would be saved somehow. But by the time they had already died. And he also told me categorically that when the gunshots were being fired, and this was a day, a very holy festival for the local Kashmiri Muslims, or Kashmiris, Muslims all over the world, Shab-e-Qadr, when the Holy Quran is recited to Prophet Muhammad. He said when the gunshots were being fired, the local neighbors increased the volume of the loudspeaker to muffle the sound of gunshots so that the army or security people are not alerted. And they left their home, they hid themselves in the fields to escape any kind of responsibility, and only came back in the morning to this drama of wailing over the dead bodies of Kashmiri Pandits. So these are the kind of challenges we face. And as far as I'm concerned, and as far as all of us are concerned here today, I think every morning when we get up, but I do it personally. When we get up, this is a wound which is right here, and I take a knife out of my memory and I remember this wound every single day of my life. The image of a 14-year-old boy whose whole family, extended family, father, mother, everyone is dead there in the courtyard, and he pulls out those quilts to make a last-ditch attempt to save his family. So as long as we remember this story, I think we will have a foothold in Kashmir Valley. Many of you have been asking me what should be done. I'm just a journalist and an author, and I wish I had all the answers. The answers have to come from all of us. I'm not a policy maker. I'm not a visionary. I'm as confused about many things as much as you are, maybe more than you. But I know a few things, and few things are that this one book is not enough. This is only a very small portion of our truth. The biggest weakness of the Kashmiri Pandit narrative in the last almost quarter of a century has been the fact that there has been very little or almost no documentation at all. And we suffer from that authenticity. I was just telling some of my friends that I was at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi recently, where these 3 films from my 3 Kashmiri Pandit friends were being shown. There's not even consensus on the number of people who left. So at least within this hall, we can have at least consensus that when you talk about the Kashmiri Pandit exodus, at least let us in this hall be clear about what happened in 1990. So on 1st January 1990, there were 75,343 Kashmiri Pandit families in Kashmir Valley. So that constitutes roughly between 350,000 to 400,000 people. So let us keep this in mind. When you quote these figures, when you're speaking to your friends, and you must speak to your friends about this, no matter whether they are in a group or a single person, we must share our story. And when we share our story, there should be absolute consensus on these facts. So on 1st January 1990, 75,343 families, constituting about 350,000 to 400,000 people. The J&K government says 219 Kashmiri Pandits were killed in those days. The figure is absolutely wrong. Till now, we have reached the figure of 786 Kashmiri Pandits who died from 14 September 1989 onwards. But as far as I'm concerned, the figure is much larger, because I also put in this list the number of those poor people who died in Jammu city or elsewhere, of those sunstrokes, of those snake and scorpion bites, of their longing for the land where their ancestors had lived for thousands of years. But technically speaking, 786 people so far. Their cases have been recorded, their FIR numbers have been registered, 786, including all these 3 massacres which happened in Kashmir Valley after our exodus. So this thing should be taken care of. The other googly which is all thrown at us always is that the Kashmiri Pandits were very elite, and you'll hear this very often in the universities here, especially in America, when they cannot puncture your narrative, the truth of what happened in Kashmir in 1990. Then they go around this merry-go-round of these vague concepts about Kashmiri Pandit elitism, that we connived with so-called Dogra Maharaja and we had these huge acres of land for us. In the state of Jammu and Kashmir in 1990, in the entire state, there were 350,000 government jobs. 350,000. Can you take a guess how many of these belong to Kashmiri Pandits? Any one of you? Just take a wild guess. Say that loudly, please.
50,000.
out of these 350,000 jobs, there were 13,000 jobs that belong to Kashmiri Pandits. Out of these 13,000 jobs, 6,000 jobs are teaching jobs. That's all we had. That's the only stake we had in Jammu and Kashmir, and that too is gone. So it's very important. I was very glad to hear my young friends quoting Samvad, etc., which I have no idea of. So it's wonderful. I think apart from a few issues which we have already spoken about, I think it's very important. Sometimes we give less credit to the younger generation than they deserve. Most of them are very sensitive, and they are aware of, by the virtue of their parents telling them these stories. I think we must make sure that we tell these stories to our younger generation of where we came from, where our roots are. Many of us are disappointed because we make these trips to Kashmir once in a while as tourists, and we are very disappointed because it does not match at all with the Kashmir that is in our memory, the Kashmir, the pre-1990 Kashmir, because the whole topography of the land where we live has changed. But I think that should not disappoint us. I think we should make it mandatory, at least visit Kashmir, at least from a far off distant land like the United States, at least once in 2 years, and take your children along with you, so that they know where we came from and whatever land is. I think that would be all. Thank you.
I want to add something to you, to what you said, so that that can go in. After that we can do the question answer. And there are people here who will correct me if I'm wrong about the elitism and about the acreage that went to Kashmiris and all that. I think most of the people probably here already know this, or if they don't know this, then in was it 1953, land to the tiller?
Yeah.
All the land was taken from the Pandits or whosoever had it and was given to the farmer. And Kashmir is the only state in the whole of India where the landlord was not compensated. So that acreage was all gone. It was never ever compensated. That's a very important thing. When we are talking about jobs and everything, that thing was stripped from us. All the land was stripped from us.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Rahulji. I think he deserves a standing ovation. He has recreated that painful story. So we are all together in this painful saga. So this is an effort that we are appreciating and reminding us of our duties. So on this note, we will start the question answer session. I know most of the question answer sessions we already did, but still it will be better if you have any questions for Rahulji. I know, just keep in mind that he is an author, and we wish that he sooner enters into the think tank about Kashmir expert from Government of India. So address your questions keeping in mind that he is an author, and we will start from Anjali ji. Yes.
Rahul, as a journalist, I know you've been back in Jammu, visited the camps. Could you talk a little bit about what the state is in the camps today?
Okay.
How many people are there still in?
Let me talk about two things. I think the other issue also needs to be talked about, what happened. Now, all these camps, which used to exist till about 2 years ago in different parts of Jammu city, Muthi, Mishriwala, other places. They were dismantled 2 years ago, and all of them were sent to this small place on the outskirts of Jammu city, which is about 10 miles, roughly 10 miles from Jammu city, in this place called Jati. The state, the government spent about 169 crores on this township, where about 4,000 families of Kashmiri Pandits live, from all these former refugee settlements, and they've been all put in these one-room dwellings, quarter-shaped dwellings. Out of these 169 crores, very little money has been spent on these actual construction. And all this money does not come from the state government, by the way. This all money comes from the so-called Prime Minister's package, rehabilitation package for Kashmir, out of which this money has been taken. I was investigating this story about two and a half years back, and I realized the number of companies that have been floated, that were floated for the construction of these settlements do not exist today. They were just created for siphoning of this money, and this money is gone. Now, when you visit this settlement today, even 1 year before, when they were only 1 year old, these quarters, these dwellings look like 30, 40 years old. The construction is of absolutely substandard quality, but that is the least of their concern. The main concern is that they have been evicted from the heart of the Jammu city, and this is a large mass of people. We are talking about 16 to 18,000 people who are living in this particular settlement, and they have been virtually cut off from the rest of the Jammu city. One, the government has made sure that even if the Kashmiri Pandits did a symbolic gesture of any kind of protest on a 14th September or a 19th January, this mass is not in a position to do any kind of protest. The children who depend on Jammu city to get, to go to schools or colleges or do their coaching for various professional courses, they have to commute to Jammu city every day, and it's not an easy commute. After 8 p.m. there is no transport available for the return. The other thing is the kind of financial uprootedness this whole exercise has led to, because in many of these erstwhile refugee settlements, in Muthi for example, or Mishriwala for example, many families had created small businesses around these camps. So someone was running a chemist shop or a departmental store. A few people I know had bought these small diesel gen sets to be rented out for marriages. There was this one particular family I met who get a relief of monthly relief of those 5,000 rupees, out of which 1,500 go as EMI for this diesel gen set. Now they have been uprooted from these places, and there are no shops in Jagti, or there is no one to rent this diesel gen set to. So the family is practically a family of 7 people, is practically living on 3,500 rupees, which is far below even than the Planning Commission's ridiculous definition of below poverty line in case of the rest of India. So in some families, I met in Jagti personally, they are going through a very hard time. The other problem is, in very rounded words, Jagti is going through a lot of crisis these days, and it seriously requires some kind of very hardcore social intervention. But I'm not sure how this intervention, people are Pankaj and I have been talking about it, and we are hoping to visit soon after I return. So I think after that, I should be in a better position to tell you what exactly we can do. If you have any thoughts about this, then please share them with me. The other issue is, which goes beyond the purview of refugee camps, is what happened to those people who returned to Kashmir Valley under this 2008 Prime Minister's package. 1,416 people, these young men and women who traveled back to Kashmir Valley for jobs. They are going through a harrowing experience. They've been put up in these 5 temporary security camps spread across Kashmir Valley, but in their case, really, security is last of their concern. Their main concern is the kind of harassment and discrimination they are facing at the hands of their colleagues in various offices. Some people came to meet me secretly at the place where I was living, and they're completely depressed. They do not know how to deal with it. And some of them come from lower middle class families, and they badly require those government jobs. So I think that is a large cause of concern for all of us.
Obviously, you have been involved with the whole thing from being a Kashmiri Pandit. You've been involved with this thing personally as well. What kind of challenges do you face in telling this story on a broader scale? What were the challenges that you faced? And the reason I'm asking this is because we were discussing earlier on telling the story again and again. I'm pretty sure we could probably...
Well, the first challenge, I divide my life in the pre-book phase and the post-book phase. So in the pre-book phase, the main challenge I faced was from my own people, the fact that they would not want to share their stories with me. I was left frothing, especially in Jammu, when I begged family after family that they should tell me what happened in 1990 if they have any stories to share with me. So that was main struggle as far as storytelling is concerned. But I'm glad after this book is out, that scenario has changed completely. And I'm struggling now to collect people's stories when, at events like these, when people come to me after the event and say, what happened in Sopore in 1986 or Anantnag in 1984, etc., etc. So I think we are looking at a possibility of collecting all these testimonies and putting them somehow on a central platform, which one of us was talking about earlier. So I think that's going to happen very soon. Some of us are at it, and I think that will happen sooner than later.
Thanks, Ramji. Once again, I'm making an announcement that we have the books that we are discussing about. Our moon has blood clots, and actually we have the honor that the author is here, and we will take his signatures. And one thing that I would like to say that this is the book that Rahul has written. It is not his story. This is our story. This is my story. This is your story. So we collectively should take the ownership